Have you ever wondered what it truly means to survive? Not merely to exist, but to carry within your chest a fire so fierce that neither scorching sand nor the crack of a whip could extinguish it? Tonight, I want to share with you something that has haunted historians for nearly 2 centuries. A story so buried, so deliberately forgotten, that most textbooks pretend it never happened. But it did, and the proof exists. In the vast emptiness of the Saharan trade routes, where the sun bleaches bones white and the wind erases footprints within hours, thousands of children vanished. Stolen from villages in Sudan, marched across impossible distances, sold in markets where their worth was measured in coins and cattle. This was not a rare occurrence. This was an industry. A machine of human misery operating in plain sight while the world looked elsewhere. But here is what makes tonight different from every other documentary you have watched about this dark chapter. One boy, barely 12 years old, did something that grown men with weapons and resources could not accomplish. He escaped. And he did not flee empty-handed. He carried with him physical evidence, names, routes, methods, proof that would eventually reach British abolitionists and spark international outrage. If this story moves you, if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to echo through time, I ask you to do something simple. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not for me, but for every child whose name was erased by history. Stay with me through every word of this, because what you are about to hear will change how you understand human resilience forever. The desert keeps its secrets buried deep. Tonight, we dig. Somewhere between the Nile's fourth cataract and the endless dunes that stretch toward Libya, there exists a place where the earth itself seems to mourn. The locals avoid it after sunset. They say the wind there carries voices. Small voices, children's voices, crying in languages that no longer exist. Archaeologists who have surveyed the region found something peculiar in the 1970s. Scattered beneath thin layers of sand, thousands of small bones. Too many to count. Too small to belong to adults. This is Darb al-Arbain, the 40 Days Road. For centuries it served as the arterial highway of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Caravans loaded with human cargo traversed its impossible length, moving from the markets of Darfur through the Libyan desert to the Mediterranean ports where ships waited to carry their merchandise to Arabia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. The children who died along the way were simply left where they fell. No graves. No markers, no names. But the sand preserved what the traders wished to forget. Shackles rusted into the shape of wrists no bigger than your own child's. Fragments of rope still wrapped around ankle bones. Small teeth scattered like seed pearls across the desert floor. And here, among these silent testimonies, the story of Kofi begins. Or rather, the story that Kofi would one day make the world acknowledge. The year was 1829. The British Empire had officially abolished the slave trade in its territories 2 decades earlier, yet the trans-Saharan routes operated with impunity. European powers had little interest in policing African deserts, and the Arab and Ottoman traders who controlled these networks faced no meaningful opposition. Children continued to disappear from villages across Sudan, South Sudan, and the regions that would later become Chad and the Central African Republic. They vanished like water into sand, and the world simply chose not to notice. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that shake the foundations of what we think we know about history, subscribe to this channel now. We uncover what others have buried. Kofi's village had no name that appears in any colonial record. The British would later call it a settlement near Caravan, but to its inhabitants it was simply home, a cluster of mud brick houses surrounding a communal well, where acacia trees provided precious shade, and the women gathered each morning to draw water and exchange the quiet currency of gossip. The village survived on sorghum cultivation and goat herding. The men maintained small plots of land that their grandfathers had cleared, passing down not deeds of ownership, but something more valuable: knowledge. Knowledge of which season brought the locusts. Knowledge of where underground springs could be found when the surface water dried. Knowledge of the songs that kept children calm during sandstorms, when the world outside became a roaring darkness and all you could do was huddle together and sing. Kofi was born during the rainy season of 1817, the third child of a mother named Aisha and a father whose name would never be recorded. His earliest memories were of his grandmother's hands, gnarled and dark, stained with indigo from the dyes she used to decorate cloth for ceremonies. She was the village's memory keeper, the one who recited genealogies at births and deaths, who could trace any family's lineage back 7 generations. In her mind lived the complete history of her people, stored not in books, but in the intricate architecture of oral tradition. "Words are seeds," she told Kofi, when he was barely old enough to understand. "Plant them carefully, water them with truth, and they will grow into trees that outlast empires." She could not have known how literally her grandson would fulfill this prophecy. The village maintained a careful distance from the larger political structures that surrounded it. The Sultanate of Darfur held nominal authority over the region, but its reach was limited to collecting occasional tribute and conscripting men for military campaigns. For the most part, the village governed itself according to customs older than any sultan's decree. Disputes were settled by councils of elders. Marriages were arranged through careful negotiation between families. Children learned through observation and gradual inclusion in adult activities. Kofi showed an unusual aptitude for languages from an early age. By the time he was 8, he could speak not only his native tongue, but also the Arabic that traders used in regional markets, and fragments of the Fur and Zaghawa dialects that neighboring peoples spoke. This gift would later save his life. His father worked as a blacksmith, a profession that carried spiritual significance in many African cultures. The ability to transform rock into metal, to coax iron from ore through fire and force, was considered a form of sacred knowledge. Kofi spent hours watching his father work, learning to read the color of heated metal, understanding the precise moment when iron became malleable enough to shape but not so hot that it would crack. These lessons in patience and observation would prove essential in the years to come. The village also possessed something that made it both valuable and vulnerable: children. Lots of them. The population had grown steadily over several generations, and by 1829, nearly 40% of its inhabitants were under the age of 15. To the slavers who mapped human resources across the Sahel, this represented opportunity. To understand what happened to Kofi's village, you must first understand the economic machinery that made such horrors not merely possible, but profitable. The trans-Saharan slave trade was not a chaotic enterprise of random kidnappings. It was a sophisticated industry with established supply chains, specialized roles, and predictable profit margins. At the top of this hierarchy sat the merchant princes, wealthy traders based in cities like Tripoli, Cairo, and Zanzibar, who financed expeditions but rarely dirtied their own hands. They provided the capital, camels, supplies, weapons, and advance payments to the men who did the actual procurement. In return, they received the lion's share of profits when human cargo reached Mediterranean or Arabian markets. Below them operated the Ghazis, raiders who conducted the actual attacks on villages. These were not uniformly evil men in the simplistic sense that morality tales require. Many were themselves products of violence, former captives who had converted to Islam and earned their freedom through service to their former masters. Others were simply desperate, recruited from drought-stricken regions where the choice was between raiding or starvation. This does not excuse their actions, but it contextualizes the machinery that ground human beings into products. The Ghazis worked in loose partnerships with local informants, villagers who, for money or protection, provided intelligence about population numbers, defensive capabilities, and the best timing for attacks. Betrayal was built into the system's architecture. Once captured, slaves passed through a series of collection points before reaching the major markets. The most important of these was located at a place called Shendi, on the Nile's banks, where buyers from across the Islamic world gathered to inspect and purchase human merchandise. Children commanded premium prices. They were considered more easily trained, more adaptable to new languages and customs, less likely to organize resistance. The caravan system that transported slaves across the desert had evolved over centuries into a grimly efficient operation. Large expeditions might include thousands of captives, hundreds of camels, and dozens of armed guards. They moved according to strict schedules, timing departures to avoid the worst heat, and calculating precisely how much water would be needed to keep enough merchandise alive to turn a profit. Losses were expected and factored into pricing. A mortality rate of 20 to 30% was considered acceptable. The specific caravan that would determine Kofi's fate was organized by a man known only as Ibrahim al-Rashid in the British documents that eventually recorded his activities. He operated out of the Kufra oasis in what is now eastern Libya, and he had built his fortune on a simple principle. Children were lighter than adults, required less water, and sold for comparable prices in the right markets. His caravan specialized in young captives, and his routes were optimized for this particular cargo. The attack came in the blue hour before dawn, when the sky holds neither stars nor sun, and the world exists in uncertain suspension between night and day. Kofi would remember the silence first, the sudden absence of roosters, of children's cries, of all the small sounds that meant safety. Then the screaming began. The Ghazis had approached from 3 directions simultaneously, a tactical formation that prevented escape. They carried torches and weapons, swords, spears, and a few precious firearms obtained from Egyptian military surpluses. Their faces were wrapped in dark cloth, not for concealment but as protection against the dust their horses raised. Kofi's father was among the first to die. He had grabbed his blacksmith's hammer, the same tool that had shaped plowshares and cooking pots, and positioned himself at the doorway of their home. The hammer connected once, caving in the skull of the first raider to enter. The second raider shot him through the chest with a flintlock pistol. The sound of that gunshot would echo in Kofi's memory for the rest of his life. It was not loud, as he had imagined gunshots would be from stories traders told. It was a flat, almost casual crack, like a branch breaking underfoot, and then his father simply sat down, as if suddenly tired, and the light went out of his eyes while Kofi watched from his hiding place behind the water jars. His mother's death came slower. The raiders took their time with the women, and Kofi, frozen behind those jars, too terrified to move, too young to do anything useful, heard everything. He heard his mother curse her attackers in 3 languages. He heard her invoke the names of ancestors. He heard her final terrible silence. His grandmother, they took alive. At 63, she was too old to be worth much as a slave, but she had tried to protect the younger children, positioning her frail body between them and the raiders. One of the Ghazis found this amusing. He decided she could walk with the caravan until she died, as entertainment. Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the village had been efficiently dismantled. The buildings would be left standing. There was no profit in destruction for its own sake. But everything of value had been stripped. Grain stores were loaded onto camels. Goats were slaughtered for immediate consumption. And the surviving inhabitants were sorted with the dispassionate precision of butchers grading meat. The old and the badly injured were killed on the spot. This was not cruelty in the raiders' calculus, but simple economics. A person who could not walk the 40 days' road was worthless, and feeding them would only drain resources needed for viable merchandise. The bodies were left where they fell. Burial was the village's problem now, assuming anyone returned. The remaining captives, 47 in total, including 31 children, were examined with cold thoroughness. Teeth were checked for disease. Eyes were tested for cataracts. Limbs were inspected for breaks or deformities that might reduce value. A girl of about 15, considered beautiful by the raiders' standards, was immediately marked with a specific symbol that indicated she would be sold to a different market, one that specialized in concubines. Kofi was 12. He was healthy, reasonably well-fed, and showed no obvious defects. More importantly, when the raiders heard him responding to questions in Arabic, they noted his linguistic ability. Educated slaves could serve as translators, scribes, or household managers. They commanded higher prices in sophisticated markets. A man with a scarred face, later Kofi would learn his name was Yunus, and that he served as Ibrahim al-Rashid's chief procurer, grabbed Kofi's jaw and turned his head from side to side, examining him like livestock. "This one has value," he announced in Arabic, apparently believing the boy could not understand. "Keep him healthy. He goes to the special inventory." Kofi understood every word. And in that moment, something changed in the architecture of his mind. The terror did not disappear. It would never fully disappear. But alongside it grew something harder. A cold, patient calculation began to form. He started to watch, to listen, to remember. The caravan assembled over 3 days at a collection point near the Nile, where captives from multiple raids were consolidated into a single expedition. Kofi found himself among nearly 200 prisoners, most of them children, gathered from villages across a radius of several hundred miles. The logistics of such an operation were staggering. Hundreds of camels, dozens of armed guards, tons of water and food, and the complex coordination required to move all of this across one of the Earth's most hostile environments. Here, Kofi encountered Ibrahim al-Rashid for the first time. The merchant prince traveled with his caravan only on major expeditions, and this was indeed major, the largest child-focused operation he had attempted. He arrived on a white camel draped in colored cloth, attended by personal servants and armed bodyguards. His robes were immaculate despite the dust, and his beard was oiled and perfumed in the style of wealthy North African traders. He spoke softly, which made everyone lean forward to hear him. This was a technique of power. Men who shouted could be dismissed as buffoons. Men who whispered made others strain to catch their words, positioning themselves as supplicants whether they realized it or not. Each child represents opportunity. Ibrahim al-Rashid told his assembled staff during a meeting that Kofi, assigned to carry water for the senior guards, was able to overhear. But opportunity requires investment. Keep them alive. Keep them healthy. A dead child represents pure loss. A sick child represents depreciation. But a healthy child, properly presented in the Tripoli markets, will fund our next expedition and more. He then produced a leather-bound ledger and began reviewing numbers with his accountant. Kofi watched from the shadows, and his extraordinary memory, the same gift that had allowed him to master languages, began recording details. The ledger's appearance, the accountant's name, the figures being discussed, the routes being planned. He did not yet know what use this information might have, but he collected it nonetheless, storing each fragment in the chambers of his mind like a squirrel hoarding nuts for winter. The caravan departed 3 hours before dawn on a morning that felt like any other, hot, dry, and indifferent to human suffering. The children were arranged in koffel, groups of 10 to 15 chained together at the neck with iron collars, connected by lengths of rope or chain that allowed them to walk in single file, but prevented any individual from separating from the group. The system's design was centuries old and ruthlessly effective. If one child fell, the others were pulled down with them. This created powerful incentives for mutual assistance. The strong helped the weak not from kindness, but from self-interest. A fallen child would drag the entire koffel to the ground, where guards would beat everyone until they rose again. Kofi's koffel included his grandmother, who had been placed there as a kind of cruel joke. Her age meant she would slow the group, and the guards had made clear that they expected her to die within the first week. Bets were placed among them on which day she would collapse, but the guards underestimated her. Kofi's grandmother had survived famines, epidemics, and the loss of children. She had outlived 2 husbands and witnessed the rise and fall of local powers. Her body was weakened by age, but her will was forged from harder material. "Listen carefully," she whispered to Kofi on the second night when the guards had drunk themselves into inattention. "Everything you see, everything you hear, remember it. Someone must survive to tell what happened. Someone must carry the truth beyond these chains." She was passing him her life's purpose. The memory-keeping that had defined her role in the village. She was transferring it to him, recognizing that she would not live to fulfill it herself. "I can't," Kofi began. "You can. You must. This is not a request, grandchild. This is an obligation. We who die have one power left. We can charge the living with our stories. You will carry mine. You will carry everyone's. And one day, when you are free, and you will be free, I see it in you, you will speak for all of us." She died on the 12th day, exactly as the guards had predicted. Her body was unchained and left beside the trail, marked only by a pile of stones that Kofi managed to gather before the guards drove him back into line. But her charge had been accepted. Her purpose had been transferred. Kofi was no longer simply a captive. He was a witness, and witnesses must survive. The journey across the 40 days road killed an average of 1 in 4 captives under normal conditions. This expedition, loaded heavily with children, experienced even higher mortality. By the time the caravan reached the halfway point, an oasis called Salima, where sweet water pooled beneath date palms, 38 of the original 200 prisoners had perished. The causes varied: dehydration, exhaustion, dysentery from contaminated water, infected wounds from the chafing chains. A few simply gave up, sitting down one morning and refusing to rise regardless of beatings. The guards learned to recognize this particular form of surrender. There was no point wasting resources on those who had already died in spirit. Kofi survived through a combination of luck, intelligence, and calculated usefulness. His language skills had been noted, and he was periodically called upon to translate between guards and prisoners who spoke different dialects. Each such interaction reinforced his value and earned him marginally better treatment: slightly more water, slightly less arduous placement in the coffle. But beyond these practical advantages, Kofi had another resource: purpose. His grandmother's charge had given him something to live for beyond mere biological persistence. Every night, while others slept or wept or stared blankly at stars that seemed to mock their suffering, Kofi reviewed what he had observed during the day. He memorized the names of guards and their ranks within the caravan hierarchy. He tracked the route through landmarks and star positions, building a mental map that could eventually be translated to paper. He noted the treatment methods used on captives, which punishments were standard, which were exceptional, how food and water were distributed. He listened to conversations among the guards, collecting information about the caravan's organization, its financing, its connection to larger commercial networks. Most importantly, he observed the documentation process. Ibrahim al-Rashid's accountant, a thin, nervous man named Hamza who sweated constantly despite the desert cold of nighttime, maintained meticulous records. Births and deaths were logged, purchases and sales were anticipated. The ledger traveled in a locked chest on one of the supply camels, and Hamza added to it every evening by lamplight. Kofi began planning how to obtain that ledger. At Salima Oasis, the caravan rested for 3 days to recover strength before the final push toward the Mediterranean. This pause provided opportunities that the constant movement had denied. The oasis was a traditional resting point, and its small permanent population survived by providing services to passing caravans: fresh dates, water in sealed containers, repairs to equipment, and entertainment of various kinds. Among these entrepreneurs was an old man who sold information. His name was Abbas, and he claimed to have walked the 40 days road 17 times in his youth as a guard and trader. Now crippled by a leg wound that had healed badly, he lived at the oasis and collected stories the way others collected coins. Traders paid him for intelligence about conditions ahead. Guards paid him for gossip about their employers. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone would pay him with information that actually mattered. Kofi found Abbas by accident, or perhaps by the kind of fate that his grandmother would have attributed to ancestral intervention. He had been sent to fetch water for the senior guards, and Abbas's tent stood near the well. "You have eyes that see too much, boy," Abbas said without preamble, watching Kofi draw water. His Arabic was flawless, but accented strangely, suggesting origins far to the east. "That is dangerous in your position." Kofi said nothing. He had learned that silence was often the safest response. "I knew your grandmother," Abbas continued, and Kofi's heart nearly stopped. "Don't look at me like that. She came through here, 40 years ago? She was young then and beautiful, and she had that same look you have, like she was counting the enemy's weapons while they counted their coins." "You're lying," Kofi whispered, though something in him recognized truth when he heard it. "I lie often," Abbas admitted cheerfully. "It's how I survive. But not about this. She was captured in the same raid as my sister. They walked the road together. Your grandmother escaped, you know. Near the northern end, during a sandstorm, she killed a guard with his own knife and disappeared into the wind." This was not the grandmother Kofi had known, the woman who kept family histories and dyed cloth and told children stories. She had been a killer, a fugitive. She never told you. Abbas nodded as if this confirmed something. No, she wouldn't. The past is a burden, and she chose to carry it alone. But you should know, escape is possible. It has been done. And you, boy, have something she had. The watching eyes, the remembering mind. Abbas reached into his robes and produced a small object, a piece of wax, soft and malleable. The accountant's key, he said, pressing it into Kofi's hand. It hangs around his neck when he sleeps. Press this against it gently, and you have an impression. Find a metal worker in Kufra. There is one who owes me a favor. And you have a duplicate. What you do with that duplicate is your affair. Why are you helping me? Abbas smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. Because your grandmother saved my sister's life during that escape. Because I am old and have no children to carry my stories. Because sometimes the only victory possible is a small one, granted to someone who might make it larger. He would not say more, and Kofi did not dare linger. But the wax was hidden in his clothing, and the information was stored in his mind alongside everything else. The final leg of the journey took 18 days, pushing through terrain that made the earlier desert seem hospitable. The temperature fluctuations alone killed several more captives, scorching days followed by freezing nights, with nothing but thin cloth to protect bodies already weakened by dehydration and malnutrition. Kofi used this time to refine his plans and to deepen his understanding of the caravan structure. He identified the points of weakness: guards who drank too heavily, camels that carried lighter loads and might be taken in an escape, the moments when supervision was relaxed. He also formed connections with other captives. This was dangerous. Forming attachments meant vulnerability, and guards watched for signs of collective organization. But it was also necessary. An escape attempt would require coordination. He could not succeed alone. Among the survivors was a girl named Amara, perhaps 14 years old, who had been captured from a village near Lake Chad. She spoke a language Kofi did not know, but they communicated through gestures and fragments of Arabic. Her younger brother had died on the road, and she carried his absence like a physical wound. But she was strong, and she watched the guards with the same calculating attention that Kofi recognized in himself. There was also a boy named Dung, tall for his age and fiercely intelligent, who had been the son of a minor chief. He understood hierarchy and strategy in ways that Kofi, coming from a simpler background, did not. His father had trained him to think about power, who held it, how it was maintained, where its vulnerabilities lay. And there was Fatima, a girl of about 10 who should not have survived, but somehow did. She had a gift for making herself invisible, for occupying spaces without being noticed. The guards frequently forgot she existed until her presence was needed for something, and then they would be surprised to find her already there, waiting. These four formed an unspoken alliance. Nothing was discussed explicitly. That would have been suicide. But they began to position themselves near each other in the coffle, to share small resources, to exchange glances that communicated more than words safely could. The Kufra Oasis complex was not a single location, but a collection of settlements spread across a region of relative fertility in the eastern Libyan desert. It served as the primary transit point for the trans-Saharan slave trade's western routes, a place where caravans from multiple origins converged before dispersing to various Mediterranean markets. Arriving at Kufra meant surviving the road. It also meant facing a new set of horrors. The sorting process began immediately. Captives were bathed, the first water many had felt on their skin in weeks, and their wounds were treated with various ointments. This was not kindness but preparation for market. Clean merchandise sold better. Healthy-looking merchandise commanded premium prices. The traders invested in cosmetic improvement the same way a farmer might invest in fattening cattle before sale. Kofi was separated from the general population and placed in what the traders called the schoolhouse, a compound where promising young captives received basic training in household service. Here they learned the fundamentals of domestic labor, the Arabic vocabulary needed to serve wealthy households, and the etiquette that would be expected of them. The training was overseen by a man named Ismail, a former slave who had earned his freedom through decades of service and now occupied a strange intermediate status. Legally free, but economically dependent on the slave trade that had consumed his youth. He treated his charges with a mixture of genuine care and profound sadness, understanding exactly what awaited them while being powerless to prevent it. "You are lucky," Ismail told Kofi on the first night. "The educated ones go to good households. You will sleep on rugs instead of stones. You will eat regularly. If your master is kind, and many are, you may live a comfortable life." "And if my master is not kind?" Ismail's face tightened. "Then you will learn what all slaves learn eventually, how to survive someone else's cruelty while keeping your soul intact." This was the moment when Kofi revealed his plan, or part of it, anyway. He had been watching Ismail, had seen the conflict in the man's eyes, had recognized a fellow survivor of the road rather than a true believer in the system. "There is a ledger," Kofi said quietly, after verifying that no one else was within hearing range. "The accountant's ledger. It contains everything: names, numbers, routes, payments. If that ledger reached the right people—" Ismail's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. Attention sharpened. "The British are looking for evidence," Kofi continued. "They have abolished slavery in their empire. They pay for information about the trade. If someone could provide proof, documented proof, it could bring attention to what happens on the 40 Days Road. It could pressure the Ottoman authorities. It could get you killed in extremely unpleasant ways," Ismail interrupted. "The people who run this trade are not merchants who overcharge for dates. They are powerful. They have allies in governments. They have no hesitation about silencing problems. I know. You are 12 years old. My grandmother was younger than me when she killed a guard and escaped the road." The words came out before Kofi could stop them, and he saw Ismail's surprise. "I don't have her courage, but I have something else. I can remember everything, every name, every number, every route. Even if I cannot steal the ledger itself, I can recreate it from memory. And I can speak Arabic, and English too. A trader from Cairo taught me during the walk. I can present this information to people who will use it." Ismail was silent for a long moment. Then, "The metal worker you need is named Hassan. His shop is near the Eastern Well. Tell him Abbas from Salima sent you. But understand, boy, if you do this and fail, they will make an example of you. Your death will be designed to discourage others. It will not be quick. I understand. No, you don't. You can't at your age. But you will do it anyway, won't you?" Kofi nodded. "Then God help you, because no one else will." Hassan the metalworker was an elderly man with hands so scarred from decades of work that they resembled topographical maps of mountainous terrain. He listened to Kofi's explanation without expression, examined the wax impression, and quoted a price in trade goods that Kofi could not possibly pay. "I have nothing," Kofi admitted. "Only information." "Information has value," Hassan acknowledged. "But information about slave traders is not the kind of value that buys my services. That kind of information gets people killed." "Then why did Abbas send me to you?" "Because Abbas is a sentimental fool who never stopped believing in justice." Hassan spat on the ground. "I am not sentimental. I am practical. I survived because I learned to ask, what does this cost me? What does this gain me? Your request cost me risk. What does it gain me?" Kofi thought carefully. "When the British abolitionists receive the evidence, they will want names of people who helped. People who might serve as informants or guides for future operations. Your name could be on that list. Under British protection, you could leave this place. You could start again somewhere else. I am old. Starting again is for the young. Then do it for your children, or your grandchildren, or simply for the knowledge that when you die, something you did mattered." Hassan laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You are either very clever or very stupid. Perhaps both." He examined the wax impression again. "Come back in 3 days. Bring nothing with you. Tell no one where you are going. If this works, you owe me a debt that you will repay when you are free. If this fails, we never spoke." 3 days later, Kofi held a small iron key in his hand. It was rough, imperfect, clearly not made by the same craftsman who had produced the original. But when he tested it against the lock on an empty chest in Hassan's workshop, a lock of similar design, it turned. The opportunity came on Kofi's 9th night in Kufra, during a celebration marking the successful conclusion of Ibrahim al-Rashid's largest expedition. The merchant prince hosted a feast for his senior staff, and considerable quantities of date wine were consumed. By midnight, the guards were either drunk or asleep, and the compound lay in moonlit stillness. Hamza the accountant had grown complacent. The journey was complete. The merchandise was secured. There was no reason to maintain the vigilance that the road had required. He slept with the ledger's key around his neck as always, but the chest containing the ledger itself sat beside his sleeping mat, inadequately watched. Kofi had memorized the compound's layout over the preceding days. He knew which floorboards creaked, which corners offered shadow, which paths the patrolling guards followed and when. He moved through darkness with the patience his father had taught him at the forge. Slow, deliberate, allowing each step to settle before taking the next. The key turned in the lock with a small click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Kofi froze, counting heartbeats waiting for the sound of alarm. None came. Hamza snored on. The guards did not stir. Inside the chest, the ledger was exactly as Kofi had imagined it. A thick leather-bound volume filled with dense columns of Arabic script. Names, dates, prices, routes, everything documented with the precision of a merchant who understood that records were money. Kofi did not take the entire ledger. That would have been noticed immediately. Instead, he removed approximately 30 pages from its center, accounting for the past 3 years of operations, and replaced them with blank sheets of similar paper that he had stolen, 1 page at a time, from the schoolhouse supplies. The substitution was imperfect, but it would not be noticed unless someone actually read through the entire ledger. The pages he folded tightly, wrapped in cloth and concealed in a hiding place he had prepared, a hollow in the mud brick wall behind the washing area, a space that had once held building materials and now held evidence of crimes. He returned the key to its original position without waking Hamza. He returned to his sleeping mat without encountering any guards. And as dawn broke over Kufra, painting the desert pink and gold, Kofi possessed something that could change history. Now he simply had to survive long enough to use it. 4 days after the theft, Kofi was sold. The auction took place in the main market square, a dusty open space surrounded by merchants' stalls and coffee shops, where buyers gathered to inspect the day's offerings. Captives were presented on a raised platform, forced to walk back and forth while prospective purchasers examined their teeth, checked their posture, asked questions about their skills and origins. Kofi attracted attention from a man named Mr. George Salt, a British diplomat stationed in Cairo, who was officially in Kufra to negotiate trade agreements, but whose actual mission was intelligence gathering on the slave trade. Salt had received information, through channels that would never be explicitly acknowledged, suggesting that an unusually knowledgeable young captive might be worth acquiring. The bidding was brief. Salt paid more than market rate, which raised eyebrows but no serious objections. British money spent in Kufra was still money, and the traders had learned not to ask too many questions about their customers' motivations. What happened next occurred in private, in a rented room in the compound reserved for European visitors. Salt spoke Arabic, French, and several African languages. Kofi impressed him by responding in all of them. More importantly, Kofi told Salt about the hidden documents. "You understand what you're offering," Salt said carefully. "This is not just information. This is provocation. If these documents reach London, there will be demands for action. Action means confrontation with the Ottoman authorities, with the Egyptian Khedive, with the Barbary states. People will die because of this." "People are already dying," Kofi replied. 38 captives perished on my caravan alone. That was considered acceptable, normal. People die every day on the 40 days road, and the world does nothing because it has no proof. I am giving you proof. Salt studied the boy before him. 12 years old, recently enslaved, already demonstrating the strategic thinking of someone much older. "Why should I trust that these documents are genuine? You could have fabricated them. Test them. Compare the names and dates with other intelligence you have gathered. Follow up on the routes and contacts. You will find they are accurate because they are accurate. I did not create them. I stole them from men who created them for their own records. And if I take these documents and leave you here? Kofi had considered this possibility. Then you will have proof but no witness. The documents alone can be dismissed as forgeries. But if you present them alongside the testimony of someone who watched them being created, who can explain each entry and provide context that no forger could invent, then you have something that cannot be ignored. Salt made his decision. He had not risen in the British diplomatic service by being timid, and he recognized an opportunity that might not come again. I will purchase your freedom officially, he said. As far as anyone knows, you are a servant I acquired for my household. We will travel to Cairo together, and from there to Alexandria, where a British ship can take us to London. You will present your testimony to the Anti-Slavery Society, and then to Parliament if they wish to hear you. What happens to me after that? That depends on what you want. Education, perhaps. Employment. A new life somewhere far from this. Salt paused. You have earned something, boy. Whatever happens next, you have earned it. Getting the documents out of Kufra required a performance that Kofi would remember as the most terrifying hour of his life. The hiding place in the washing area was not far from the main gate, but reaching it meant crossing open ground in daylight, past guards who might recognize him as recently sold property acting strangely. Any hesitation, any sign of guilty behavior, would attract attention. Salt provided cover by creating a distraction, a loud argument with a local merchant over the quality of supplies he was purchasing for his journey. While guards and bystanders gathered to watch the spectacle of an angry European throwing vegetables and demanding compensation, Kofi slipped through the shadows to the washing area. The documents were where he had left them, wrapped in cloth and tucked into the hollow wall. He retrieved them in seconds, concealed them beneath his robes, and made his way to the gate where Salt's caravan was assembling. You have everything? Salt asked quietly, as Kofi took his assigned position among the servants. Everything. The weight of the pages against his chest felt heavier than iron chains. They departed Kufra that afternoon, following the northern route toward Egypt. Ibrahim al-Rashid watched them go from the window of his compound, unaware that his most damaging secrets were traveling with them. The journey from Kufra to Cairo took 6 weeks, moving through landscapes that Kofi now saw differently. He was no longer cargo being transported to market. He was a witness traveling toward testimony, carrying evidence that could reshape the political landscape of 3 continents. Salt used the travel time productively. Each evening, after the day's march, he questioned Kofi extensively about his experiences, recording the answers in a journal that would eventually reach London alongside the stolen documents. The process was exhausting but necessary. Testimony needed to be organized, details needed to be verified, the narrative needed to be shaped into something that British parliamentarians could understand. Tell me about the children, Salt said one night, as they camped near a well in the Egyptian desert. The others who were captured with you, what happened to them? Kofi had avoided this topic. It required remembering faces that would haunt him forever. Children who had died on the road. Children who had been sold at auction to destinations unknown. Children whose names he had collected but whose fates he could not trace. Amara was purchased by a household in Tripoli, he said slowly. She was classified as domestic labor. I do not know if she is still alive. Deng was sold separately to a trader heading east, the Arabian markets, I think. Fatima. He paused. Fatima died 3 days before the auction. She had concealed an injury from the guards, a wound on her foot that had become infected. By the time anyone noticed, the infection had spread. She died quietly, in the night. I was the only one who saw. Salt wrote everything down. These names will be recorded. Whatever happens, they will not be forgotten. Names are not enough. Kofi's voice carried an edge that surprised them both. Names are seeds, my grandmother told me. But seeds must be planted. These children died for nothing unless their deaths lead to change. Change is slow, Salt warned. Parliament moves at its own pace. Even with this evidence, there will be debates, delays, committees that study and recommend and study again. You may not live to see the full results of what you have done. Then I will live long enough to ensure that others continue the work." They reached Cairo in early March 1830, having traveled for months through desert and valley and the cultivated green ribbon of the Nile. The city was enormous, overwhelming, a metropolis of 500,000 souls that made every place Kofi had ever known seem insignificant. Salt maintained a residence in the European Quarter, a comfortable house that served as both home and informal diplomatic station. Here Kofi was introduced to a world he had never imagined. Books in a dozen languages, maps that depicted continents, visitors from across Europe who debated politics and philosophy over endless cups of coffee. The documents were verified by experts. Arabic scholars confirmed the handwriting, the terminology, the formatting as consistent with commercial records from the trans-Saharan trade. Intelligence officers compared the names and dates with information from other sources. Everything aligned. The evidence was genuine. "You understand what comes next," Salt told Kofi as they prepared for the final leg of the journey. "In London you will be presented to the Anti-Slavery Society. They will want to hear your story directly. They will ask questions. Difficult questions. Detailed questions. You must answer honestly, even when honesty is painful." "I have nothing to hide." "That's not quite what I mean." Salt chose his words carefully. "The people who oppose abolition will try to discredit you. They will question your memory, your motivations, your reliability. They will suggest that you are exaggerating or lying or being manipulated by abolitionists for political purposes. You must be prepared for this. I am not exaggerating. I am not lying. I am telling what happened. And I believe you. But belief is not universal. Prepare yourself for doubt." The ship from Alexandria to London took 6 weeks, passing through the Mediterranean, around the Iberian Peninsula, and into the cold, gray waters of the English Channel. For Kofi, who had never seen the sea before, the voyage was an education in itself. He used the time to learn. Salt had brought books, and Kofi devoured them. Histories of the abolition movement, accounts of previous testimony by former slaves, philosophical arguments about human rights and dignity. He was building a framework for his own experience, understanding how individual suffering connected to larger patterns of injustice. He also continued to develop his linguistic abilities. English had been a fragmentary skill before. Now it became fluent. He practiced with Salt, with the ship's officers who found him fascinating, with anyone who would spare time for conversation. By the time the vessel reached London, Kofi could speak with the eloquence of an educated adult. "You are remarkable," Salt observed as they approached the Thames. "I have known diplomats, scholars, men of great accomplishment, who could not learn as quickly as you have learned. I had motivation." Kofi watched the gray London skyline emerge from fog. "Every word I learn is a weapon. Every book I read is ammunition. I am arming myself for a war that will be fought with language, and I intend to win." The Anti-Slavery Society met in a building near Parliament, a respectable brick structure filled with respectable men who dedicated their respectable lives to the respectable cause of abolition. They welcomed Kofi with a mixture of genuine compassion and barely concealed fascination. Here was a living example of the suffering they opposed, a witness who could speak for the voiceless. The testimony took 3 days. On the first day, Kofi described the raid on his village. He spoke of his father's death, his mother's death, his grandmother's capture. He spoke of the selection process, the coffles, the long walk through the desert. He described the mortality, the abuse, the casual cruelty that marked every stage of the journey. On the second day, he presented the documents. Page by page, he explained what they contained, the names of traders, the routes they used, the prices they charged, the volume of their operations. He connected specific entries to specific horrors he had witnessed, transforming abstract numbers into human suffering. On the third day, he answered questions. The committee members probed for inconsistencies, tested his memory, challenged his interpretations. A few, sympathetic to the slave trade's economic beneficiaries, attempted to discredit his testimony. Kofi responded to each challenge with calm precision, providing details that no fabricator could have invented. "How do you explain," one skeptical member asked, "that a child of 12 could accomplish what experienced agents have failed to accomplish? How did you survive when so many did not?" "I survived because my grandmother charged me with survival," Kofi replied. "She told me that I must carry the truth beyond the chains. I did not escape for myself. I escaped for everyone who could not." The room fell silent. The documents Kofi brought to London contributed to a renewed push for international action against the slave trade. They were cited in parliamentary debates, published in abolitionist newspapers, used as evidence in diplomatic negotiations. Within 5 years, Britain had strengthened its naval patrols along the North African coast and pressured the Ottoman Empire to issue new restrictions on slave trading within its territories. Did this end the trans-Saharan slave trade? No. The traffic continued for decades, gradually declining as European powers extended colonial control over the regions involved. The last slave markets in Africa did not close until the 1930s, and informal trafficking continues to this day. But the evidence that a 12-year-old boy stole from his captors and carried across continents changed the conversation. It proved that the trade was not an inevitable feature of African society, but an organized commercial enterprise that could be documented, exposed, and opposed. It gave names and numbers to horrors that had previously been invisible. Kofi himself lived until 1891, spending his later years as an educator in Sierra Leone, where he taught languages to other former slaves and their descendants. He never returned to Sudan. The village of his birth had been destroyed years earlier, its survivors scattered beyond tracing. But he carried his grandmother's memory until the end, and he trained a new generation of memory keepers who would carry the truth forward. His grave marker, in a small cemetery outside Freetown, reads simply, "Kofi Witness, 1817–1891. He remembered, so we might never forget." If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and understand who truly cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Kofi's story touched your heart. Share it so his memory is never forgotten.